Good evening, everyone. A very special talk for us from the Alkazi Foundation for many, many reasons, some of which I will iterate now. But Susan has been, I can only say, a close friend of India and Delhi for many, many, many years. Close friend of the foundation and of Mr. Alkazi himself, having amassed her collection of over 1,500 maps, vintage maps, printed maps, over 25 years, that we acquired 10 years ago. But that acquisition was made over a 15-year time period. The collection was first viewed, or first thought of being collected by Mr. Alkazi in the 80s. He eventually acquired them in 2006. We are very lucky to have her here today, and for the last week, in fact, at the insistence of Mr. Shakil Hussain, who is sadly not with us right now, but who is working tirelessly, I should say relentlessly, to organize an exhibition on the Ganga at the National Museum, and we hope to see this come to light very, very soon. We would also therefore like to thank the India International Center for their partnership in organizing this talk. I was talking with Susan a few days ago about the nature of the collection, how it was managed, how it was acquired, how this compendium of maps was made relating to India, while she wrote several books, one better than the next, acted as the chairperson of the International Map Collectors Society, edited that journal, traveled the world, and returns now with great enthusiasm. And though quite diffident in her response about her achievements, I think it goes without saying that Susan's collection of maps are very unique, almost as unique as Susan is herself, because they are hand-picked, they are very dynamic, because of the breadth of the collection, but also what they provide in terms of scholastic possibility. I will iterate some of this. Susan has been in and out of India for well over 30 or 40 years, as a matter of fact, working in the capacity of a writer, an editor, a copy editor, even a designer. And when in Britain, now in Britain, settled over there, has taken on the professional role, she says, of a gardener, making her own rare flowers come to life and sort of planting her own vegetables to consume on a daily basis. And so this is very important for Susan now. And here, while she was here, she was working with Paul's Press from the 70s onwards, and we are very grateful to have with us Sunita Paul over here as well, editing not only its theatre journal Annexe, but several other publications, and as I realized, also Roshan Alkazi's publication on ancient Indian costume from the late 70s. The associations for us, therefore, go on and on. And an expression, I could say, of a life that is constantly renewed and constantly relived. After parting with her collection to the foundation and recalling with great delight that she traveled the world for some time with what she had reaped, it was interesting to know that the maps were actually collected between 1977 and 2006, at a time when there was very little that was published on Indian maps. And it begged the question for us, how do you begin a collection? What do you look for in that collection? Possibly following her father's interests, who had a collection of African maps, I particularly enjoyed this anecdote that Susan gave us, quite generally, is that when she was looking to gather a particular map of India as a gift for someone in India while she was in Britain on one of her trips, she realized that the account of Indian maps in a collection of world maps was only a small paragraph long. And this really affronted her, because at that point of time she realized that she was Indian and that she should do something about this immediately. So at a time when maps tell us about where we belong and who we are, an anecdote like that for me simply tells us that we can belong everywhere and anywhere, And Susan is very much Indian if she likes it so. The maps are varied. Some of them are limited edition maps, several published in 3 publications over time: the early maps of India, India within the Ganges, and the maps of Mughal India. These are printed maps, including rare examples of Ptolemy's Geographica, drafted in the 3rd century BC, but printed much later, 15th century, late 15th century. Very often Susan noted, and this was interesting, that America is not even on these maps. And this is so because Columbus had not made that journey yet. But what that did provide was a sense that there was a building of knowledge over time, and maps represented this kind of building of knowledge. Her books precede more recent pioneering work on antiquarian maps, such as those of Mansi Lahiri and Pilar Maria Guerreri, who have written extensive books called The Maps of India and The Mughal Maps of Delhi, that was launched just a few days ago by Niyogi Books, giving a broad survey of material available and discovered since, as well as marking other remarkable collections, such as those of Prashant Lahotis from Kalakshetra, and I'm happy to say that he joined us just for one day today to meet with Susan. This collection, the core of the collection, had maps originally until 1800, and with the assistance of a friend, she managed to build this collection into the 20th century. What is interesting is also the technical history of what surveying represents today, what it means today. The process of measurement via triangulation. This came several years after cartographers had to get a sense of how to make a map by taking into account travel journals by explorers in order to draft early maps. Very often those accounts are sometimes whimsical, and hence the maps are objects of fiction that are born from real experiences, but have no claim to fact. But beyond guesswork and observation, in the collection we see rare examples showing even present-day Pakistan as well as India. Nicholas Germanis's map of Pakistan from the 1480s, Bernardo Silvani's maps from the 1511 edition, the map of Pakistan also going up to the late 15th century. The first map of the East India Railway, with a proposal for a line-up country from Bengal from 1846, sketches of explorers, Godfrey Vignes of Kashmir and Little Tibet, J.D. Hooker of Sikkim and East Nepal, James Todd map of Rajasthan. We notice a shift to military interests, frontier skirmishes, campaigns in Punjab and Afghanistan, the disposition of the army of the events before 1857, town plans that include those of Goa from 1572, guidebooks, gazetteers by firms such as Thomas Cook, Murray, Higginbotham's Nilgiris, navigation maps covering the whole of the west coast from the Arabian Sea to Cape Comorin. The survey maps, started by James Rennell of Bengal in 1767, and the story of Warren Hastings buying some of these for £30 in 1781. 3 editions of those maps also are in the collection, and they show how the system of collecting moved from a kind of company trading to administration. So all in all, we gradually locate through these maps moments of exchange, moments of intersection and movement, so as to arrive at multinodal understandings about historical memory and social mobility. Even aspects deeply significant today, such as climate, economic production, and sociological research, which again yield discoveries that are constantly debated politically. And so without further delay, I would like to welcome Susan to the stage and to thank her profusely again for her immense and meticulous contribution, not only for collecting these exquisite works, but for her continuing involvement with us in giving it new life in these new times. So Susan, please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Rahat. I think he's told you so much about maps that I hardly need to talk. But I will proceed. I hope my voice can be heard clearly.
Yes.
I'm going to give a rough overview of, I added it up, it's less than 3% of what is in the Alkazi collection. The first printed maps of the Indian subcontinent were published in Italy in 1477. They were included in the 26 maps drawn to accompany the second printed edition of Ptolemy's Geographia, which had been written in the 2nd century AD in Egypt. The first edition was without maps. Claudius Ptolemy belonged to a line of Greek geographers, some of whom are known to have drawn maps, but his are the only ones that survive. In his book, he listed the latitude and longitude of all the major towns known to him and the location of rivers and mountains. Whether he actually drew the maps or they were drawn later from his coordinates is disputed, but they were certainly known under his name in the 15th century. Forgive me if I will list many names and many dates which you can all forget about if you don't need to remember them. These are two of the maps from his 12 covering Asia, as far as it was known at the time. On the left is the 9th sheet showing what is now Pakistan from a 1482 edition of the Geographia, and beside it, in the adjacent sheet, number 10 of India, printed in a slightly later edition of 1490. With very rare exceptions, all maps up to the mid-18th century were printed in black only. Some printers employed painters to colour them before they left the press or for special clients. Most of them have been coloured at any time since then, perhaps even last month. Much of the information on these two maps was collected when Alexander of Macedon invaded North India in the 4th century BC. He took geographers with him and could talk to local people and recorded their findings. Also, Ptolemy lived in the major seaport of Alexandria and was in a good position to seek out more information from passing sailors. There are a large number of towns shown on the maps, which implies that the people Alexander met were very knowledgeable about their own country. As Alexander never travelled far to the south, there is more detail in his map of Pakistan than that of India. Also, he got the coastline very wrong, not knowing that it was a peninsula stretching far to the south, giving a much longer coastline than he had imagined. He had heard of the island of Ceylon, but called it Taprobana and gave it the place of the peninsula south of the mainland. Later cartographers moved Taprobana further east and eventually to Indonesia once they knew the true shape of India. Ptolemy's knowledge of the major rivers and mountains is in parts amazingly accurate. Thus he knew a lot about the Indus from Alexander, but also drew Ganga flowing from the mountains in the north, and named the Vindhya mountains and other ranges. Ptolemy's Geographia was translated into Latin just before the major voyages of discovery began, when Europeans were becoming more aware of the rest of the world, and they were beginning to build ships that could manage ocean seas rather than having to cling to the coast. When his maps were printed and became available to a wider public, his name was revered, so much so that they were issued in new editions for more than a century, long after it was known that they were grossly defective in geographical accuracy. Cartographers got round this by including the old maps, but adding new ones to reflect the new lands now in the news. This one, drawn by Martin Waldseemüller in Germany in 1513, to add to his edition of Ptolemy's Geographia. He certainly made the peninsula long enough, but only knew about the towns along the coast, very little inland. Note how Taprobana has now moved near Malaya. Such was the clamour for maps by this time that he was able to reissue his atlas 7 years later, and then to redraw the maps in a slightly smaller edition in 1522 and 1535, and reissued that one twice more. This is his new version below, with little decorations in blank spaces of the map. The King of Narasimha, the first province the Portuguese visited, now known as Vijayanagar, is sitting on his throne in the centre, looking rather European despite his loincloth, while at the top is a typical German rural scene, and below that a satanical goat is assisting a woman to commit sati, one of the strangest tales that were brought back from India. And another map was added to the Ptolemy edition in 1540 by Sebastian Münster, and it is interesting because of the wide area he gives to India. Intra-Gangan, or within the Ganges, ultra, or beyond the Ganges, India Superior, north of Cathay in China, and some cartographers even called Ethiopia and parts of Africa India Meridionalis, or southern India. Soon after, an Italian cartographer published his own version of the Geographia, and with more new maps of the latest discoveries. Jacopo Castaldi's new map for India showed only the peninsula, which he had been so lacking in the original maps, and called it Calicut, the first Portuguese settlement in India, and taking the shape from current nautical charts. Note how he drew the Maldives, which will appear rather differently in later maps. His placing of Narasimha was particularly interesting. Here it is west of the province of Bengal in the north, and he places Bisnagar, or Vijayanagar, in the centre of the peninsula, on an imaginary river he calls the Betela. But in another map of India he drew for Ramusio's collection of travel accounts, a few years later, he placed Narasimha almost at the southern tip of India, the kingdom of Delhi on a level with Surat, and that of Bisnagar in between. He also decided not to orient the map with north at the top, which was already standard custom, but orient this one to the south, so to us it appears to be upside down. As information filtered back to Europe, there was an eagerness to learn about the new towns that foreigners were visiting and writing about, but few travellers were capable of giving accurate accounts of them, or even about where the new towns were situated. Despite that, two cartographers in Germany, Braun and Holberg, published large volumes illustrating almost all the new towns. This is their version of Goa in 1572, which might have been almost any port of the newly discovered East. Below is a more authentic version of the town by a Dutchman, Linschoten, who lived there for 7 years as assistant to the Archbishop, and was keenly interested in finding out all he could about this part of the world. He also drew a large map covering the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal in 1596. But although this is widely known now, it was not as accurate as he claimed. However, his account of how Portuguese India was administered showed that it had become effete and rotten, and the country was ready for other European nations to gain a foothold and trading rights with the Mughal Empire. The English were quick to realize the profits that might be made by trade with India, and founded a company which was inaugurated on the last day of 1600 as the East India Company. Their first expedition, led by William Hawkins, met with opposition from the Portuguese and was not successful. So in 1615, with the backing of King James I, they sent Sir Thomas Roe with letters of introduction and gifts for the Mughal Emperor. Roe spent 4 years at the court and travelled with the emperor on some of his perambulations. He was able to get an extensive knowledge of North India, more than had been gathered by any traveller before. And on his way home, he met with William Baffin, known for his work in Canada, a skilled cartographer. Together, they drew this map of India, of North India, which was to be copied throughout the century, being the most detailed to appear till then. One of the strange things Rowe inserted on the map was how Ganga came down to the plains at Haridwar through the mouth of a holy cow. He must have heard about this at the court and made sure Baffin included it on the map. Later cartographers, however, were not so gullible, and most removed the cow's head but retained the small lake. Rowe also probably accompanied the emperor to Lahore, as he gives so much prominence to the avenue of trees along the route. Other parts of the map are surprisingly empty or incorrect, such as his placing of Odessa or Orissa north of Bengal, with the main town of Juggernaut, as mapmakers called it after the temple there, so far away from the sea, and another Orissa where it should be. Baffin and Rowe's map was copied for many years, as no one else had much new information. Here are two by the most famous Dutch cartographers of the time, Hondius above and Blauw below, almost identical in their basic information, but without the mistake of Orissa. To make his look a little different, Blauw took out the cartouche surrounding the title from Hondius's map and replaced it with one of his own in the bottom left corner, not bothering to fill the blank spaces which had held the previous title. They had paid attention to reports from travellers who knew the places to pass through to get from Surat on the coast to the court at Agra, and marked them as a continuous line. They also added a large lake east of Ganga, from which the major rivers of East Asia arose. This had been reported by a Portuguese sailor shipwrecked off the coast of China and imprisoned for some years, who later travelled extensively and reported erroneously on the geography, as no such lake exists. The Dutch, of course, at this time were not very interested in India, as their trading stations were in the East Indies, where they fought off attempts by the British to compete with them for the plentiful spices growing there. At the end of the 17th century, an important map of South India was drawn in Italy by Coronelli. He was a keen geographer who founded the first geographical society in Europe. The map is obviously based on Baffin and the Dutch cartographers, but with many additions where Coronelli doubted their veracity. The almost straight line for Ganga is more pronounced, and the Jamna with Delhi on its banks, but much reduced in importance. He also kept the Dutch Great Lake in the east and named the rivers flowing from it. The large river flowing from central India to the Bay of Bengal at the bottom of the map, Coronelli names as Guenga, but it also has been called Ganges and other names, and was on most maps until the third quarter of the 18th century, when its existence was questioned and it gradually disappeared. The map deserves better study, as it marks the end of much false information and prepared the way for more accurate knowledge to appear on maps during the 18th century. This rather gaudy map by Mathieu and Seuter is very decorative, and perhaps the colouring detracts from appreciation of what the map contained. Geographically, it follows the standards set up for maps of the Mughal Empire, so Ganga flows almost directly south, and at Haridwar is a lake replacing the cow's head. The route from Surat to Agra and on to Delhi and Lahore has place names all along it, but distances are grossly distorted, so that Agra is due north of Orissa, as it had been in Coronelli's map 50 years earlier. The cartouche at the bottom left is florid and imaginative, depicting the wealth of the empire. The sea god rides with his horses beside a woman pouring forth pearls, or perhaps spices, from a pot she holds under her arm. The decoration around the scale bar at top left repeats the stream of pearls, with cherubs trickling them through chubby fingers. Near them are ivory tusks and two parrots. The ship is magnificent in its detail, all designed to give an expression to the wealth to be gathered from the east. Confidence that the ship carried your goods was well built and that the sailors knew how to navigate correctly was paramount to merchants at home. So charts to aid navigation were becoming more easily available, being now printed instead of manuscript. On the east coast there was no natural harbour except up the Hooghly River, and its location had the added advantage of easy access to the Mughal province of Bengal, which is with its rich merchandise of indigo, muslins and other materials. Another growing problem was piracy, usually by renegade Portuguese escaping religious persecution or finding larger fortunes to be made by brigandage. In 1658, Johannes Janssen published his Atlas Maiores, using plates inherited from the famous Dutch cartographic family of Hondius, and in direct competition with the second cartographic family of Blau. His Sinus Gangeticus, or Ganges Bay, was probably his own creation, turned towards the west so that the Bay of Bengal and land on either side was more prominent. There is also more detail about land away from the shore than the usual sea chart included, but the ramlams were there to aid navigation, and the shore towns and villages a sailor might reach by mistake if blown off course. Some 70 years later, a similar map by Edmund Halley, better known for the comet named after him, shows only a little better detail, although being a simpler map was perhaps easier to read. There's no information about land away from the coastline, beyond the names of kingdoms, and he shows long outdated knowledge with his kingdom of Narsingha, south of Orissa. The additional compass rose at the center of the ramline's lower right was useful for sailors going beyond the Bengal to other trading places further east, such as Java and Sumatra, as well as further north to China. Atlases composed solely of sea charts were first published in the Netherlands, but their interest was in the East Indies rather than around the coast of India, so they had little that was useful for merchants travelling to Surat and other Indian ports. The English pilot, with charts of the coasts around the British Isles, first appeared in 1671, and it was John Thornton of London who regularly updated them. So it's no surprise that Thornton eventually in 1703 published Oriental Navigation with charts of India's coast in the third volume. Thornton and his son Samuel continued to update them as soon as the ship returned with the information that might make navigation easier. Separate sheets were also available from the Thorntons and other chart makers who followed them to offices along the Thames. This chart of the approach to Surat shows how treacherous the sandbanks were and what a narrow channel there was through which to reach the port. By the middle of the 18th century, there was so much interest in India that many magazines regularly had articles from returned travellers and commissioned maps to accompany them. This one of the countries around Surat and Bombay by Thomas Kitchin was published in the London Magazine of 1759 and forms a good contrast to that of Thornton. The sandbanks of Surat are marked, but perhaps not in enough detail to be useful to sailors. But then magazines were for travellers at home, not those crossing the seas. By this time, far more was known about places along the far from the coast. There's a route to Brampur with overnight places to stay named all along. The caves and temples of Ellora have been written about, and there's a road passing close by them. Bombay was acquired by the English in 1662, but it was then a few small huts on desolate islands. 100 years later, it was important enough to be named in the title of a map, and the British were beginning to sail directly there rather than to Surat, where there was competition with other Europeans. Pune is probably a misplaced Pune, and the imagined Ganga or Ganga river shown flowing into the Bay of Bengal on previous maps is also included on this map of Western India. Map making was clearly a lucrative trade and attracted what I call bogus map makers. One such was Peter van der Aar in Leiden. He re-engraves maps that had been published by earlier cartographers as much as 200 years earlier and published a large quantity of them. He began with plain maps to illustrate the routes of explorers, and when they sold well, he put them into elaborate borders, expanding or condensing, stretching or squeezing the geography to fit within them. This one, printed first in Dutch, supposed to show the route taken by William Hawkins from Surat to the Mughal court, and appeared without a border in 1707. To increase sales, he published them again with a French translation of the title in this elaborate border of 1514 to gain a wider market. There is nothing new in it, and the route he shows from Surat to Agra is probably double the distance it should be. In France, however, there were serious attempts to depict the current geography and include the latest reports as they became available. Guillaume de Lille is said to have begun drawing the maps when only 8 years old, and he later became the premier géographe du roi in Paris. His position at court enabled him to receive the latest information, as was reported by both religious and secular travellers. He also maintained a wide correspondence from many parts of the world and was much respected for his geographical knowledge. The French and the English carried their European antagonism to South India, and both countries were intent on gaining control by using local rules to side with them and defeat those employing soldiers of their rival. This is the only map de Lille drew of India, but it was reprinted in many editions over the next 50 years, sometimes with minor changes to the title. It follows the Convention of India, shown on 2 pages, the Mughal Empire on one and South India on the other. Henri Abraham Chatelain was another notable French mapmaker in the early 18th century. Here he follows a local tradition of placing maps alongside text and pictures to make his books more attractive to his readers. In the centre is the line of descent from Tamerlane at the bottom to Firoz Shah at the top, and below are 3 pictures of elephants fighting, the king being weighed in gold, and another depiction of Sati. There is a perfunctory map of the Mughal Empire, but more interesting is that of Kashmir on the right. This part of India was little known at that time to Europeans, but François Bernier had published a book about his travel there some 50 years earlier, and included a map he had drawn, and this is what Chatelain includes here, titling it A New Map. The text across the centre concerns the emperors and a brief description of Kashmir, taken from Bernier. Another celebrated French was Jean-Nicolas Belin, who works as a hydrographer at French Marine Office. His first atlas with maps of India was published in 1763 and contained maps of the whole coastline of India from the Gulf of Cambay round to the Bay of Bengal in a handy side, suitable for enjoying at home or carrying abroad. His maps are very neat, and he was able to include all the best information. This was probably the peak of French cartography, and there are several good cartographers I have not got time to talk about, such as the Sanson family and the Robert de Vaugondis. The French were possibly the best cartographers in the early 18th century until they were surpassed by the British. This map was drawn by Belin, but was re-engraved for an English book of travels by Thomas Salmon. The town of Dew in upper right is another map by Belin. The colouring is modern, also copied by Salmon in England, lower right. You can see how closely it was copied from the similar style of the title, the placing of names for the buildings, even the number of windows in each, and the boats on the shore. Belin had the flourishes top and bottom, which Salmon left out, perhaps thinking simple was best, and his map would be more appealing in its practicality. The plan of Bombay is an original Belin, and the detail he included is obvious. It's not a nautical chart, rather a book for the would-be sailor to enjoy by the fireside at home, when reading about how Bombay was fast developing into a major centre of the British in India. Note the measured depths, the dangerous rocks, and the sand shoals. He marks Trombay in upper right, a good place to overwinter. The maps I have been showing you are all by well-known cartographers. Some are hard to find nowadays, some command high prices as their supply dwindles, some are beautiful, some are simply copied from other maps with a new title or cartouche. At least maps of India have not reached the stage when modern copies are passed off as originals because demand exceeds supply, as happens to those of USA or the countries of Europe. But now I will take a break and show something I found intriguing, not by a famous name or particularly appealing in design. Few will have heard of it either its subject matter or its maker. This is the map of country of George Thomas on the left, or more correctly, the kingdom of George Thomas. Thomas was an Irish charmer with a smooth tongue. 6 feet tall, he had a commanding appearance, and though apparently illiterate, he had a very sharp mind and learned quickly how to manage men. From a poor family in Tipperary, Ireland, he joined the British Navy, but by the time his ship was ploughing through the torrid waters of the Indian Ocean, he decided he wanted something better. He jumped ship in Madras, and after a while reached the Mughal capital of Delhi. There he met the legendary Begum Samru, and one meeting was enough. He became her chief of army and her lover. But then he was displaced by another Frenchman, and wounded pride took him away from her court. For a while he served under one of the lesser Maratha commanders, but being a subordinate did not suit him. He decided he wanted a kingdom of his own, and fixed on Haryana, not yet under the control of the British, but eyed by the French as an area they might use as a base in their struggle against their European rivals. He had already received grants of land from Begum Samru, as well as the emperor, and when he conquered a hill fort which he fortified and later called Georgegh, it was easy for him to move on to Hisar and make it his capital. Georgegh is on the map, but just outside the boundary to the southeast. Hisar was the old capital of Prithviraj Chauhan, and there are still high embankments from that time. Thomas built up the town, and buildings still stand from his time. He set up his own mint and issued coins bearing his name. He cast cannon in his own foundry, and when he ran out of brass, he successfully raided south to the territories of Jaipur and north to those of the Sikhs. At one time he approached the British government at Calcutta with a suggestion that they should employ him to defeat the Sikhs, who were becoming ever more of a threat to the north. His plan was refused by the bureaucrats of Calcutta. Thomas's rule in Haryana did not last very long, only 3 years at Hisar, as he was too successful to be permitted to continue by other jealous rulers. In 1801, an agreement was made between the Marathas, the Sikhs, and the French to destroy him. They stormed the town, and he was taken prisoner. So great was his name and smooth his tongue, he was able to negotiate an honourable retreat, and to be allowed to go back to the British in Calcutta. He was escorted there by an officer called William Franklin, Thomas fell ill and died before reaching Calcutta, but on the long journey recounted his memoirs to Franklin, who later published them in a book, in which this map can be found. George Thomas was one of the most romantic figures in an age that abounded in adventurers and heroes, and only after seeing his map did I bother to learn more about him. After this digression, back to better-known maps, and on to James Rennell, the most famous of all those who made maps in India and known as the father of the modern survey of India. Rennell also came to India with the British Navy, but far from jumping ship, he was appointed the first surveyor of Bengal in 1767. By this time, the East India Company were administering large parts of Bengal and to the north and east of the state, and required accurate knowledge of the areas to collect taxes. Rennell built up and trained a team of men to work under him and spent months out in the field himself. As he pieced together the small rough surveys into large maps, he sent some back to England. Due to ill health from the long periods in the jungle and far from comfortable towns, he eventually returned to London and was disappointed to find that his maps had been printed by East India Company without his knowledge and by fitting ill-matched surveys together. This is one of them, which was reprinted several times, despite Rennell's comments that it was not a good map from his surveys. Rennell was appointed official geographer to East India Company and spent the rest of his life preparing fair copies of his maps and publishing them so that they might be of use to the new administrators of ever-expanding areas of the subcontinent coming under British rule. The first major work he undertook was to gather and perfect maps from his surveys into a 13-page Atlas of Bengal in 1780. Very few copies of this edition survive, one in the collection of course, as most were dispatched to India for use there, and the ship carrying them was captured by the Portuguese. So Rennell republished it the following year with an additional 8 maps. Having worked so long in the Bengal area, he was able to publish many detailed maps of Ganga, which are invaluable to scholars today. It was fast becoming the best route to travel inland and safer than the roads of the period. Then he drew a map of the whole country, published in 1782 and enlarged it in 1788. This is his first edition, and the cartouche has always amused or irritated me, depicting the Brahmins handing over their sacred documents to a statue of Britannia, as if they were pleased to be a subject nation. He also, following D'Anville, wrote a memoir to accompany the maps, detailing his sources and where other maps might be incorrect. This was so popular, it was republished in updated and enlarged editions far more often than the map itself. Once James Rennell had placed most parts of India correctly on his maps, it was easy for others to prepare their own maps with specific themes. One of the last decorated atlases, whose publishers still believe the public like to look at pictures rather than bare maps, was published by Taliesin Virtue in the middle 1800s. He would not only get the geography of Punjab, extending as far as Baluchistan, much in the news when it was published in about 1850 after the Sikh Wars had ended in triumph for Britain, but he also gets Sultan Mahmud's towers and fortress at Ghazni, and also boats on the Indus, and a view of Lahore with a polo match in progress. Many families now had relatives in India, and they were all keen to learn more about the country without studying hefty volumes or spending hours in libraries, which were becoming popular and often free. After Rennell's retirement from the East India Company office, Aaron Arrowsmith became the leading cartographer there. He drew the last large map of the country to be based on route surveys in 1804. His meticulous engraving, use of the latest surveys, and attention to detail made very fine examples of the cartographic art. This extract of Delhi and surrounding areas from his map contains a lot of information of areas to the east, but to the west the map is emptier, as fewer people able to draw a correct map had travelled there. It was a large map, 160 centimetres by nearly 190 centimetres, so suitable to frame for an office wall, but not so easy to handle for the traveller, real or armchair. So plenty of smaller atlases continued to be published, but without pictures seen in the earlier maps. Triangulation had been first used in France by the Cassini family, who took 45 years of laborious work to complete their measured survey of France. When they showed it to the king, he was furious to see his kingdom had shrunk in 5 sides from what he felt it should be. In India, the first measured baseline was 6 miles long, was laid down near Madras in 1802. So long as the chain used for this baseline was absolutely stable in its length, in all temperatures, and was handled with total accuracy, it was possible to build up triangles over huge distances, but not so easy in India with its varied and often inhospitable terrain and suspicious local people. However, by the time the last line was measured near Dehradun, it was found to be out by only an inch or 2 from computed measurement. The fact that the peninsula turned out to be 40 miles narrower than thought did not matter as much as it had to the French king. It was then the task of topographical surveyors to fill in the triangles with surveys on the ground until the whole subcontinent was correctly known and mapped. Later followed detailed revenue surveys to fix boundaries for taxation, a geological survey, and then an archaeological survey. Such maps could all be used by other publishers for their own purpose and to suit varied interests. The crowning achievement was the Indian Atlas, begun by John Walker in the India Office in 1825. By 1859, 67 sheets had been published. After 1867, production moved to Calcutta. Engravers were sent out from England to train local men, and soon the standards were equal to those in England. The early sheets were approximately 795 by 645 millimeters in size, but later it was found more practical to make quarter sheets in order to hasten the time between a survey in the field and a map being available for use. This very detailed map of Kashmir was drawn in the East India Office by John Walker, based on surveys made by G.T. Veen when he went there in 1835. Few Europeans had been there, although it had long been a favourite with the Mughal emperors. To help with orientation, when this map is too detailed to read on the screen, Srinagar is marked with an arrow. Veen must have travelled all over the area, as he names both summer and winter tracks through the passes, local names, lakes and valleys, the courses on rivers, also geological and botanical information, and seasonal movements of herdsmen. There's a wealth of additional information, such as sites of a Buddhist temple and an old Buddhist well. Nearby is the castle of Kamba Raja Dihao Singh. It would be possible to check how much of the details shown here is still to be seen on the ground, although much of it is now in Pakistan. 2 more detailed maps of Punjab, made by private publishers within 3 years of each other. Both have been used, probably in the field, and have many handwritten notes on them. On the left, the one published by Allen has a note added at the bottom that red denotes British, brown are protected states, and green are Punjabi. The date on this map is 1846, which means it was hot off the press for English readers, and the Treaty of Lahore, bringing an end to the fighting, was signed in March that year. The most serious fighting took place around Firozshah, which is why it's the most crowded area on the map and shown in detail on the right. Below is a map of 1849, 3 years later, by Wilde, after the Sikhs had lost the so-called Second Sikh War. This time the worst fighting was in Multan, finally taken by the British in January of that year. Already the map shows the red line covering most of Punjab, now under British rule. There is also more detail all over the map, as the British Army was able to collect geographical information from a much wider area. Up-to-date military maps were necessary for the army to keep track of where their troops were based at a quick glance, which might be the best to rush to a war zone. This one is titled Sketch Map, showing the disposition of the Bengal Army, compiled in the office of the Quartermaster General of the Army for July 1844. The army is called the Bengal Army because the headquarters for British India was in Calcutta, but they were also available for deployment in both Madras and Bombay presidencies. Very few such maps have survived, as they were secret documents at the time and were never widely available. This one is too large to show the whole map on a small screen, but it shows the large army camp at Meerut, a smaller one at Delhi, larger ones at Agra and Gwalior and Kanpur, and others scattered around the country. Each shows the number and name of the various regiments or units stationed there with their standards. Printed a few years later than this is a similar map that once belonged to Lord Edinburgh, Governor-General from 1842 to 1844, as it is stamped Earl of Edinburgh's heirlooms. He would have been consulted in London after his return when the insurgents started in 1857, and perhaps given this map then, which was made probably in India in 1857. It was mounted on cloth and in a red leather folder with gilt lettering and design. As a contrast, a much later war map of 1919, made for public consumption to give readers at home an idea of where war might break out, but no detail about what was happening there. After the First World War, Britain worried that Russia might choose this time to encroach on their empire from the north. Afghanistan had long been recognized as a valuable buffer between India and Russia, but the warlike tribes had never been subdued and might well form to Russian blandishments. Both Calcutta and Lucknow feature in large-scale maps at this time. Lucknow because it was so important when the town was besieged for so long, and anxious relatives in England wanted to understand where family members might be suffering and even dying, and Calcutta because it was very much the hub of British India, at the end of a large railway system, and home to so many civil servants of the company and soon of the crown. They all needed to know where people lived, how to get there, and where the main offices and warehouses were situated. There were many maps of Lucknow printed in books about the troubles, but mostly they were copies from a couple of originals. The one on the left is by Edward Weller from his Weekly Dispatch Atlas of 1858, and shows the residences where the British had been besieged for some months. There had been a major survey at Lucknow the previous year, and this is reduced from that survey when the town was the centre of the news. The Calcutta map is large and very detailed, the first one of this type available for sale, and this is a detail showing the mint and the custom house with the Hooghly Bridge linking the town and the railway station. The full title, not visible here, calls it Plan of Calcutta from Actual Survey in the years 1847 to 49 by Frederick Walker Sims, Consulting Engineer to the Government of India. The suburbs of the town are from surveys subsequently furnished by Major H.I. Twillier, Deputy Surveyor General of India, executed by himself and Captain R. Smith, Revenue Surveyor, revised in 1857. It is printed on 2 sheets, together making a map of 2.5 meters by 2.3 meters, so to a large scale and able to show every street, a valuable resource for students in the history of Calcutta. This is one of the few large-scale maps of Delhi from the first half of the 19th century. It was still the capital of the Mughal Empire, but it held no real power. It is, however, a thematic map with a title of A Topographical Survey of a Portion of the Delhi District showing the principal basins of drainage and the positions of the old bunds, although the situations of the ancient cities and the objects of archaeological interest. It was made by a survey by F.J. Burgess in 1848-49. Till this time, Delhi had little importance for the British government in Calcutta. It was a place to visit, to pass through on the way further north, to give formal honor to rulers of the past. But this was to change dramatically within a few years, when in 1857 the attempt was made to restore the power of the Mughal emperor and to be rid of foreign rule. The streets of Delhi ran with blood, and victorious British soldiers became so drunk it was necessary to close the liquor shops. Very little is shown here of the town itself, with all attention going to the surrounding areas and the ruins dotted all over from the many towns that had existed here earlier. Many of the Mughal nobles had their country houses outside town, and some are carefully depicted and named. Detailed surveys continued to be made as more of India fell under British power, especially around the coast. As more and more ships left Britain for India, taking people back and forth and goods both into and out of the country, the need for accurate navigation charts was growing, with correct soundings making it safe for large ships to enter the harbours. Karachi by this time had become a major port. Surveys were made and corrected many times as sandbanks shifted or river mouths silted up. Like this one, I like this one particularly because it records the skeleton of a whale that had been washed ashore. The full chart is titled India West Coast, Tidal Channels of the Indus from Manora Point to the Kaha River, surveyed in 1848-9 by W.A. Faber, Acting Master, Indian Navy. It was reprinted in updated versions in 1852, 1866, and 1877, as it was so important to know how the monsoon tides had changed the navigation travels. Survey work did not stop in 1859, where the sheets for the huge Indian Atlas were nearly all printed. Small-scale maps were required to give a general idea of the area, and then large-scale maps were made once detailed survey on the ground was done. Of Peshawar was printed at the Survey Office in Calcutta in 1897. The compass point on the top indicates that it is not oriented true north, which becomes obvious when it is observed that Nowshera is actually due east of Peshawar. It shows the newly built railway line between Peshawar and Nowshera continuing on to Khairabad. Railways were first built in what is now Pakistan in 1855, with several small companies competing for lines. Gradually the companies merged, and the Northwestern Railway, named here, was formed in 1886, which managed the line from Rawalpindi further east to Peshawar through Khairabad on the provincial border. The second map of Peshawar was drawn by the survey in 1899 on a scale of 1 inch to 4 miles, and it is so much more detailed that it is difficult to read, even this is only a portion of the sheet. Here contours are more carefully hatched, even small streams are drawn, and north is at the top. The north orientation is clear here with Peshawar and Nowshera on a level line. Any government or military personnel living in the area or travelling through would have used one of these maps, and they covered the whole country in such detail as the Survey of India maps do today. Styles of cartography have improved since then, making modern maps easier to handle and to read. In 1894, the Royal Geographical Society in London published an unusual map of the Karakoram Himalayas. 2 sheets showed the Bagrod, Hunza, Nagrian and Hiskar glaciers on one, and Biafo and Boltoro glaciers on the other. A third shows the route through Kashmir taken by William Conway, who drew the survey. He was a renowned climber, and his book, Climbing and Exploration in the Karakoram, was described by a contemporary reviewer as, I quote, not merely the narrative of the best organized and most successful mountaineering expedition as yet made, it is the most valuable and minute account based on first-hand evidence of a most fascinating region of the heaven-soaring Himalayas. Baltoro Glacier, at 63 kilometers, 39 miles in length, is one of the longest glaciers outside the polar regions and is located in the Gilgit Baltistan region of Pakistan administered Kashmir and runs through part of the Karakoram mountain range. Such a detailed map is ever more important today with the worry of glaciers melting and climate change. It is now a popular trekking and mountaineering resort. Another detailed map of an area that is so difficult to reach and to survey before the days of flight is this one of Tibet. It was printed in 1914, but it is unlikely that the fragile aircraft at the time would have ventured anywhere near the mountains of Tibet. There's a huge amount of detail on it, and the scale is nearly 1 inch to 4 miles. Srinagar is indicated to give an idea of the area covered, as this is only a very small portion of the whole map. Tibet had been a country of mystery and allure to travellers for many decades, and I remember the amazement when Heinrich Harre's book 7 Years in Tibet first appeared, and told us so much about life there. In the detail, on the right are picked out the Sanju Pass, Karakash and Yarung rivers, and the town of Khotan, now in the Zhejiang province of China. The whole map extends from Andijan and Abbottabad to west of Tashun and in the west to Tashun and the Kokonor lakes in the east, 28 degrees in latitude and 30 degrees in longitude. I expect there are more accurate maps now, especially as much of it is now under Chinese rule, but for 1914 this is an exceptional map. My last map brings us to the middle of the 19th century, and it's about railway stations. The date is 1949, but such a map would look so different now. The inset at bottom left shows the line of the BB and CI Railway, or Bombay, Baroda and Central Indian Railway, long forgotten now. It was inaugurated in 1855, and after several mergers eventually became the Central Railway as it is known today. The Delhi inset at the top gives prominence to Old Delhi Station, but also includes that of New Delhi, which was built in 1931 and expanded in 1951. In the collection is also a report of the Delhi Lines Committee on Railway Facilities required at Delhi to meet probable ultimate developments, published in 1919. The report includes plans for the ring road around Delhi, which was completed in the 1960s with much fanfare, but had actually been planned in 1919, even to the amount of rubble required to build the embankments. This map is called the Railway Map of India and adjacent countries, and included insets the other side of the map of Madras, Coimbatore, Calcutta and suburbs, Rangoon and the coalfields. You have seen many maps today, covering nearly 5 centuries of European knowledge of India, but these are less than 3% of the maps held in the Alkazi collection. Most of them are not available elsewhere in India, although it is now possible to see so many on websites, for a researcher looking at a whole map, there is nothing to equal the real thing, whether for feeling the paper, enjoying touching something that was perhaps made 200 years ago, seeing it all spread out before you. Some maps are so large that they do not fit easily onto a computer screen, which means you may only see a small bit at a time, or too small to read the text. In the collection are nearly 350 maps printed before 1800, about 300 from the 19th century, and over 900 from the 20th century. But I have found that historians are often not used to relying on maps, and geographers rarely look backwards. I think this is changing now, and when there is such a wealth of material available in Delhi, it will change even faster. The Alkazi Foundation in GK2 welcomes researchers who would like to use this collection for their research or publications, or even just for those who like maps. Thank you.